Hi everyone, welcome to lesson 11. Today we're going to take a look at gradients, blends, and patterns. So kind of some fun stuff that can really give like a little bit more pop, a little bit more emphasis to your art. Also it's a great way of creating depth as you're building your illustration. So we're going to take a look at lesson 11. Obviously your start files are going to be available for you on Blackboard. So if you jump over to the lesson 11 folder, here are your lesson 11 start files. And when we pop it open, it's going to look something like this. So when we're talking about gradients, first thing I want to take a look at is just how I'm going to kind of prep for working with them. So first thing is I want to make sure I see my swatches. I'm actually going to pull this out because I want that there. There's also a gradient tool along the right-hand side. So again, you can go to Window and pull up in swatches. You can go to Window and Gradient to pull this up if you're not seeing it. But I want to make sure that I have that gradient editor open. I want to make sure I have my swatches open because these are going to be kind of helpful in terms of working with them. Now, I also have a gradient tool that's over here, and we're going to use that as part of the lesson. So there's kind of multiple ways to edit as we've seen so far. So obviously gradient tool, gradient panel, swatches panel, all going to be really helpful stuff to have open. Now, before we get too far, what I want to talk about first is the three types of gradients. So you can kind of see like a little preview here. I've got linear, which is just in a line. I've got radial, which is kind of like a circle where it opens out. And really what we're doing is we're just blending out colors. So here's from left to right, here's from center to out. Then we also have a freeform gradient where we can just kind of drop colors all over the place and then control how they blend. So we'll take a look at all three of these today. And first thing I want to start off with is my background on my first page here. So here I've got this object, and what I want to do is I just want to apply a gradient to it. Now, I have some gradients that are built into my swatches panel. I can also just click on this to give me my default black to white. And when I click on this, now I'm starting to see some options. Now I can kind of change my styling. So there's my radial, here's my freeform. I want this to be linear because I want to kind of make it look like it's like a sun kind of affecting this area and blending from light to dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my gradient by using this gradient slider down here. So if I click on these stops, these are where my colors are. Now, if I click on one and then I double click it, it's going to pull open this color editor. And thankfully, I have a bunch of colors kind of pre-picked for me to work on this bottom panel. So I'm going to grab this yellow one, and I think that looks pretty good. But I don't want the sun to look like it's going left to right. I want it to kind of look like it's coming up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the angle of my gradient. I can change it, and there's all the preset kind of exact measurements. I'm just going to set this to a 90-degree angle so it looks like it's kind of blending up. Now I also have this little diamond slider, and I can kind of control how this gradient breaks. So if I want to kind of appear higher in the sky, I can also control this slider here to kind of adjust how much of that gradient I'm seeing and where I'm seeing it. So that's one way of working with it. Now, the other way of working with it is our gradient tool. So if I click on this bottom, you see how I've already got like this gradient applied. I'm going from greens to blues to kind of this darker shade. Now, instead of using just this, I can also use my gradient tool. And when I click on it, you'll see it kind of gives me almost like a little visual in-area view of what that gradient slider is. So if I zoom in a little bit here and jump back into my gradient tool, kind of see a little bit more detail here. And now what I can do is I can control how this kind of gradient looks, how it breaks, what it's going to do. So I want to play around with my gradient here. And what I'm going to do is if I hover just the outside, I can control kind of the angle it breaks from. I can use this to position where it starts. You see, as I move this bar, it's kind of affecting that gradient in real time. I can also shrink this bar down a little bit. Maybe I want to do like a full 90-degree on this. And then I can control this slider and kind of see how this all breaks. So maybe instead of doing it from dark to light, maybe I'll rotate it the other way. So go outside, rotate it. I'll bring this up. Kind of want to have something where it looks like it's kind of going light to dark. And then I can adjust where my colors go and how quickly they break in either direction. So I want this to kind of look like it's getting a little bit darker towards the bottom. So I'll bring that up. I think something like that actually looks pretty good. It's kind of giving me that like light to dark effect by using, again, same idea, just this way is a little bit more visual when you're using that gradient tool. I think it lets you kind of manipulate a little bit more accurately or a little bit more kind of, I think, freely than getting locked into certain dimensions or certain settings with the gradient tool. So either way, either the panel or the tool both work, and they kind of both accomplish the same thing. Now, what I want to take a look at is I've seen now applying gradients, changing them, kind of messing with them a little bit on object areas. What I want to take a look at is now scrolling over to our bicycle here. I want to see what it looks like to apply a gradient onto a stroke. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the tire, and I'm just going to apply that same linear gradient. I'll just click on it. Now, when I clicked on it, it looks like it filled that area. I got to make sure I'm paying attention to what I'm selecting. So let me undo that gradient. And let me make sure that here on this gradient panel, I'm not selecting fill, I'm selecting stroke. Now, if I click, I can activate or apply that gradient onto that. And now I've got my gradient applied kind of across that whole area. And it looks like it's just kind of going left to right. Now, what I can do is adjust this. There's different ways I can make this gradient work. I can just make it apply within the stroke. I can make it apply along the stroke, so it almost like follows like a circle from light to dark. Or what I can do is this one here, I can apply it across the stroke. And what this lets me do is kind of customize that a little bit more. So what I want to do is, now that I have it applied, this is probably going to look a little bit more realistic for a tire. I can also reverse my gradient. So if I want the dark side on the outside, that dark part of the outside of the tire, and then kind of go lighter to the inside. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change some of these colors. I like this dark one, but for this middle one, maybe let's double click. Let's throw some kind of darker shades on here. Let's go to maybe this purple color. And then on this inside one, let's do something maybe along this blue. It's kind of fun. And if I want to add another color, I can also click in between. So you see how here, when I hover my mouse between two of these dots, if I click a third one, I can actually apply another color. So here, maybe I want to apply an orange, and then I click away. And maybe I don't like that as much. If I want to get rid of a stop, I can click and pull away, and it'll delete that out of there. So I think this looks pretty good. Now I have my gradient saved, but what I want to do is I want to be able to use this as a swatch. I want to apply it to something else like this other tire. So when you have a gradient built, you can actually click up here and drag it down into your swatches panel. And now it's saved as a gradient swatch. So if I come back over here onto this tire, I can go ahead and select my stroke. I can apply that, and it keeps the gradient. It just doesn't remember the setting. So I have to make sure I apply it along that stroke as well. And now I've got kind of my tires a little bit more customized. So what I want to do next is I want to take a look at kind of doing a little bit more on coming back to this side of adjusting this gradient. So now I've got this pink hill, but I want it to look like this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this area, and I'm just going to use my sample tool, and I'm just going to sample that gradient. So I think this gradient looks good, but I want to kind of play with something different. I've done a bunch of linear stuff now. Let's take a look at using an oval or a radial gradient. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this radial, and it applies it to it, and it doesn't really look like anything, but when I go to my gradient tool and I have this area selected, oops, excuse me, grab this guy. Oh, and I'm on the stroke. That's the problem I ran into. You want to make sure you're selecting the right area. So what I can do is I can turn off that. I can come back into my selection area. And now if I turn it to radial, now I'm seeing that. So again, as you're working, double checking, I'm selecting strokes and fills and making sure that I'm grabbing the correct object that I want to edit. Now, have this area selected. I want to grab my gradient tool, and as I see, it's got kind of this circle part, and just like my other tool, I can kind of adjust this a little bit, where my starting point is, where it's rotating from. But what I can also do is adjust kind of the shape or sizing of this. So if I come to here, I can make it go bigger or smaller. I can adjust where my gradient breaks. What I want to do is I kind of want to make this look like kind of like a big expanded area off that center point, where it's going to go light to dark across this area. So I'm kind of clicking, I'm moving, adjusting, and kind of playing around with that. Now I think it's a little too dark, so I'm going to slide this green up a little bit more. I kind of want to have it almost looking like it's acting up on this hill. I think this angle looks good. And if I click on this top dot, I can actually squish this into an oval. I think that oval is probably gonna be a little bit better of a shape. So if I have this dark dot, this dark widget, I can kind of make it a little bit more of an oval. And I'm gonna position this a little bit more like that. And then I can grab, I think that's probably pretty good. I think maybe now that I'm looking at it with it turned off, I think I wanna bring this up a little bit. Yeah, I think a little bit more like that. So just that top edge is fitting it. And then again, I can adjust this shape to kind of fit that a little bit more. And I think that's probably pretty good right about there. So I just want to kind of do like a nice subtle like light to dark. So it kind of has that top of the hill has got a little bit more darkness to it. So now that I've got this adjusted, and I've seen kind of what the settings are with that oval tool, again, same basic principle is just going to apply that radial kind of shape to everything. So now that I've got that, next thing I want to do is take a look at this bike, and I want to apply a linear gradient across this whole thing. So coming back here, I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between these two. I got a bunch of pieces on this bike. So what I want to do is I want to apply a gradient to all of it, but I'm going to shift click to select them all. They're all just kind of different groups. I got the stems, the handlebars, all the different pieces. Now, what I can do is I can apply a gradient to it. So I have like a default one up here, this orchid. I'm just going to click on that. And you see when you select a gradient across multiple objects, it just applies them as each individual pieces. But what I can do is I can grab my gradient tool, and I can click and drag and just apply it across everything. So now it acts as all those individual pieces. It almost like groups them together. And I'm going to apply this kind of yellow to the frame, kind of make it look like it's fading out as we go across. And then it applies that onto it. So here I've got my brakes, my setting, all looks good there, and it's applying this kind of slowly across the entire gradient. So that's another way of working with our gradients. Let's jump back over here. Let's take a look at these clouds. What I want to do is I want to apply a gradient and then add some transparency to it. I want to kind of make it look like it's fading out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this, and I'm just going to apply a default gradient to it. I'm just going to do that black to white. And what I can do is I can grab my gradient tool, and I can kind of start playing around with where my position is. So I'm going to rotate this. I'm going to slide it down into position. I'm going to shrink it up a little bit and move it in a space here. And I don't want this is a cloud. I don't want it to be black. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this gradient stop here to this yellow that I have. Kind of blends nicely, but you're seeing that like this background isn't faded. It's just this solid white. But if I grab this stop here, notice I have an opacity slider. If I set that to 0, then what it's going to let me do is kind of create it like a faded kind of look for that area. So it kind of blends all that off. And if I want, I can just copy paste that same object and just maybe slide one over here too. So I can use that as kind of a nice way of blending that off. And then if I need to adjust it again, I remember I just come back into my gradient tool. Maybe I bring the stop down a little bit more. I can kind of control the color density of it by moving those sliders to kind of update that positioning a little bit. So obviously pretty kind of straightforward on that. We've seen straight, we've seen radial, we've seen adjusting them a couple different ways, angles, shapes, all that, working within strokes. We haven't seen that freeform gradient, and that's what I want to play with next. I want to come back over here to this guy's shirt. We're going to kind of make this thing a little bit more interesting than just this kind of neon green. So with this shirt selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into my gradients, and I'm going to select the color to start from. I think I'll just start with kind of this dark purple. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this freeform gradient button. So now what it's doing is it's going to apply based on just whatever it's kind of quickly grabbing. It's going to start throwing some colors in there. Now, this isn't like a regular gradient. When I go to my gradient tool, it's just showing points. And all I'm doing is I'm taking these points, and as I move them, it's adjusting how the gradient breaks against the other colors within the area. So what I can do is I can add in other points. And then when I select a point, what I can do is select the color I want it to be. So maybe I'm going to go from purple to dark. Maybe this one will do that yellow. Bring that up here. Maybe I'll add another one back here, and I'll do this blue tone. Maybe in the way back, we'll do this black. And then as we move these points, this will adjust kind of how that color goes. Maybe I'll throw like an orange one in here, just kind of really get a lot of cool kind of blending. But you can see you get some really, really interesting effects with this. You can also grab these widgets. So if you want more of one color or less of another, you can control that with that widget. So and as you see, as it moves, it kind of affects the blend of all the other colors. And then the same thing as you adjust the position of it, it kind of affects that as well. So maybe on this yellow, I want to go a little bit more bold with this. So I can kind of stretch that out a little. And I think that's looking pretty good. So there's that freeform gradient, which is a really fun, easy way of getting kind of some cool depth, some cool color blends by adjusting from lighter to darker values. You can get that. So now we've seen all three types of gradients, right? We also have talked about that we're going to do something called blends and something called patterns. So let's start off by taking a look at some blends. Now what a blend does is it basically takes two shapes and then kind of combines them together. So I've got this big guy and this little guy. And what I want to do is I want to make the whole line of the hill look like it's set with these trees. So instead of kind of copying and pasting, if I use a blend, what it's going to do is it'll kind of create two versions, the start and the finish, and then add all the pieces in between. In order to do this, I need to select two objects. And then if I go up to my objects, blend make command, it's just going to automatically add some stuff in. Now, that's my default setting, right? I can change those options. If I go back into object blend and then do my blend options command, what it's going to let me do is decide how I want to do this. Now, this is smooth color, right? I can also do specified steps. So right now there's 8 in between. Maybe I do 6. If I hit tab, I'll see it. Update. Maybe that's too. Maybe that's still too many. Maybe I'll do like 4. There we go. So I think this looks good. Now, when I have these in here, they're just kind of going on a straight line. If I double click on a blend, it goes into isolation mode. So like if I take an object and move it, it adjusts where the other objects sit and it automatically updates that path for me. Now I can also adjust this line. So with that line selected, I'm gonna come to my pen tool and I'm gonna hold down my option key so I can convert it into that line. And I can actually adjust the curvature of that line so that they're all kind of sitting on top. And then I can exit out of isolation mode. And now my trees are sitting kind of correctly along the top of that hill. That's one way of working with a blend. Another way is, got these two stars. Let's select them both and let's make a blend out of these. So I always start with just selecting two shapes, doing blend and make, right? Now, what I've got here, if I zoom in on this guy a little bit, is I've got kind of this blend of just smooth color. So if I go to object, blend, and then see my options, I'm gonna see that this isn't steps, this is smooth color. It's just kind of blending one from another. Now, same thing, if I double click and go into this isolation mode, I can select this path, I can bring it around. So here, if I want to kind of almost create like a three-dimensional shape with it, I'm going to select this and move it into the middle. I'm also going to change this color. I'm going to set it to this yellow, kind of make it a little bit more subtle as far as sitting inside that object. I'll back off, I'll zoom out, and I'm going to move that thing. I'm going to get this out of the way. I'm just going to kind of set it down here as kind of like a subtle little piece. Also notice if I shrink it, obviously I hold shift to make sure I'm maintaining my proportions. I shrink it, the blend shrinks along with it. So it's an effect that as you adjust art, it will automatically update the settings for you. So now we've seen blends, kind of a couple of ways of working with that. Last thing we're going to talk about is patterns. So there's default patterns or stuff that's built in Illustrator, and you can also make custom patterns. So what I want to do first is I want to apply a standard pattern. So I'm going to select the shirt. I'm going to add a pattern on top of this gradient, kind of really add some depth to this thing. So first thing I need to do is I need to go into my appearance window. So I'm going to go to window, down to appearance, or remember I can select this guy right here. Now, what this is showing me is all the properties of this object I have selected, right? I've got my fill, I don't have any stroke, and then I can kind of add some other things. Now, you can actually add multiple fills to a single object. You can have colors, gradients, textures, you can do a bunch of different stuff with it, and that's how you'll do this through here, through this appearance panel. Now I've got on the bottom an add new fill, add new stroke. I can actually stack multiple fills. So I'm going to add a new fill, and it just defaults to black. Now, on this fill, this is where I'm going to select my properties, my little drop-down arrow here. I've got this little swatch library, and notice I have something called patterns. Under patterns, you've got some decorative, some nature, some basic graphics. I'm going to just grab one of these basic graphic dots and take a look at these. So it looks like it's just kind of like a little dot gain pattern. So I'm going to take a look at maybe, let's try this one here. Yeah, and actually I think that looks pretty good. That's 6 DPI, 40%. And what that's going to do is just apply that pattern. So basically what I've got now is stacked layers or stacked fills. I've got my gradient, now I've got my pattern. And notice as I select a pattern, it's going to save it up here in my swatches panel for me to come back to, just as a matter of kind of consistency. So you're applying similar kind of things throughout your document. So that's one way of doing it. Now, the other way of doing it is actually creating your own custom pattern. You see on this artboard up here, we've got kind of this block of stuff. What I'm going to do is select all of it. And what I want to do is go up to my object and then pattern, and I'm going to make a pattern. So when I select this, it gives me a warning, new pattern's been added to the swatch panel. It's already right there. So I can adjust it and it's going to adjust automatically. And when I'm done, I can save it and exit out. So this is basically my pattern options here. I've got a couple different things. First thing I've got is my name. I'm just going to call this leaf. I can set it in a grid. I can brick it. I can offset a bunch of different ways. So there's different ways of looking at how you want to apply them. I'm going to do a grid. Now I've got these extra pieces here. I'm going to dump that guy out, that guy out, and that guy out. Now I want to size because I dumped those pieces out. It automatically kind of deleted them on the rest of the pattern, but it didn't resize. I can size my tile to my art so that kind of tightens it up. I can also adjust my spacing. So maybe I wanted to take this in like a 1/2 inch and kind of tighten that up a little bit. Now I've got a nice looking pattern. All looks good. I'm happy with how this looks. So when I'm done, obviously it's saved and I'm seeing it in here. So again, you can save a copy or you can just save it as is. I'll hit done and now it updates it right here. Now the original art still exists, but say that I wanted to come in here and now I wanted to apply a new fill. Well, on my fill, I can now apply this. Now, kind of interesting, but maybe I don't like the art of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on my pattern in here and it's going to take me back into my pattern maker layout. Maybe I want to change these So I'm going to select all these leaves, and maybe I want to do something more like a purple range, and maybe I'm going to do something where I take the opacity down a little bit, or let's see, on my fill, I can select my opacity. Maybe I'm going to bring that, just kind of make it a little more subtle. I'll click done. Pattern contains blah, blah, blah. Yes, I'll click OK. Now it updates this pattern in my swatches, and then it automatically updates it here. So kind of a fun way of putting that all together and then applying something new to get a little bit more texture, a little bit more pop. I'm going to select this guy. I'm going to group him, throw him over here. And because I'm all done with this, I've got all these extra artboards. I don't need all those, so you guys can go ahead and grab your artboard tool and select these and delete them out of there. I'm going to delete this extra art that I don't need. And now that I'm all set, this is my finished piece. You'll do a File, Save As command. Save this thing off onto your desktop in PDF format to email over to me. So last name dash description. You can send that over, and that will be it for lesson 11. So get your stuff wrapped up, get it emailed over to me, and then what we'll do for moving forward is, instead of an extension project this week, or for this session, what I'm going to do is just give you kind of some extra time to continue working on your custom logo project, and then we'll be jumping in on the next lesson for using brushes to create an ad. So kind of playing around with brushes, and I got a really fun extension project for you then. So hope you enjoyed working with gradients and patterns, really fun stuff, and I'll see you for the next session.